Thank you, Arctic Acoustic. I love the music. And welcome back to Hanging with History. This is Season 1, That Miracle That Happened, That One Time, Episode 19, Enclosure. Enclosure, Efficiency, and Tears. Today we're going to have Quokka98 joining us back on the program, even though it's not a Viking episode. This is our second episode of the 3-episode Agricultural Revolution arc. This is going to be a longer than normal episode, but I think it is quite dense and subtle, and it will repay your listening to multiple times. If you understand what's going on here, you're going to be way ahead of others in understanding the miracle. It's funny how sometimes there's a completely dry, like reading a dictionary dry, explanation for a phenomenon, and then when you get up close to it, squint and try to understand it, you see a tragedy. And when you spend some more time with it, to really understand it, you're moved to tears when the aha moment comes. Enclosures are like that. Enclosures are an important part of the agricultural revolution. British agriculture becomes 80% more productive than the rest of the continent, except, of course, for the Dutch and the Danes. Enclosures are part of the story. An enclosure could be as simple as fencing off a pasture adjacent to plowed farmland to extend the field. That's the first type of enclosure, converting pasture land to farm fields. And this can result in increased food yields. It can also be converting a village's fields into pasture land. This second type of enclosure results in reduced food yields, but can increase money yields for the owner of the new pasture, usually raising sheep for the wool export trade, a big important part of the British economy. This can result in the death of dreams for the villagers, usually leading to migration to towns, colonies, or just plain death.
That sounds like a terrible thing to do.
Yeah, this second type of enclosure was really risky for people doing the enclosing. Violence was likely. Murder rates were over 100 times what they are today in the early 16th century generally, when enclosures come to our attention. And a lot of people would see this as a pretty justifiable reason to kill. It created political sympathy for the villagers. Hate the landlord, love the tenant, kind of natural social monkey stuff. This sort of thing started toward the end of the reign of Henry VIII in the 1530s, a time we'll go back to in the Reformation arc, which is still to come. It's known earlier, but we'll talk about it from this time period. In England, we had the Black Death killing off so many people, like half the people, that farms were just abandoned. So later, when the population grew, new farms could be started. Existing holdings might be increased to make bigger and more efficient fields. More and more people were working for money rather than medieval labor obligations. Money wages had increased 60%, so this was great for common people in a way. But it started to hit limits. It was still a subsistence economy then. Starvation was the problem. As population increased and all the available farmland started being put into use. However, by the 1530s, there really wasn't much in the way of abandoned farmland left. And the global cooling after the medieval climate optimum continued to make marginal farmland less useful, less productive. The wool trade brought a good way for landowners to raise cash. The Flemish wool manufacturers would pay well for English wool. This was the other side of the global cooling. And English wool was considered high quality. We didn't have selective breeding as a formal process yet, written down and widely known, but livestock breeders have known about it since ancient times. In Genesis chapter 30, there's a long explanation of how Jacob bred sheep for particular traits, including health. I checked out biblical commentary in prepping for the podcast, and, this is weird. I found to my great surprise that there's a whole mass of people both criticizing and defending Jacob's breeding and veterinary practices. I hesitate to bring it up because there's so much polemics, so much trying to prove their point that most of it is so bad that it's not even wrong.
Is not even wrong the same as right?
It's more that a statement or proposition is so far from right that it's not even wrong. Wrong implies a right, that if we could agree on premises and logic, we could both come to the right answer. Not that this is an easy process. Wrong seen this way is not that bad. It's correctable. Not even wrong is worse. But of course, as a concept, not even wrong could be used by anyone as a polemical hammer against the outgroup. For the Jacob case, there is an, aha, the Bible is full of bad science, and a, no, it isn't type of crowd. They read the sentences carefully and analyze every word. I'm shaking my head over it. If you read this part of Genesis yourself, and remember recessive genes are a thing, and plant-based medicine and food supplements would have been the only thing available in ancient times, it seems an obvious sheep breeding tactic to use and one that would work given the years involved, and would certainly be obvious to someone whose life was spent raising sheep commercially. Even if they didn't have the word for genetics, they surely could not avoid a concept of it that was approximately right. Though to be fair, it does also read like the protagonist tries to use magic, but it's not a science textbook either. Scott Alexander's pointed out how new atheism as an intellectual movement in the early 21st century failed intellectually. God as a concept isn't really vulnerable until you get all the way around Aristotle's unmoved mover, and we certainly are not there, so why try? And why try so hard at a doomed enterprise? Well, even asking the question answers it. It's a social monkey thing about convincing people what they should believe. Atheism as a religious movement, if you will allow that term. Stirner, certainly an atheist himself, provides an accurate picture when he describes pious atheists. Seems like more stupidity smart people commit. Or to steelman new atheism, maybe they're just trying to lower the status of the religious. That's not as stupid, just usual monkey stuff. Could even be political if your main concern is something like Islamic fundamentalism and lowering its status so it won't attract as many followers. That's more Hobbit-like and more okay, less evil. Anyway, for our podcast purposes, we see pretty widely known breeding principles at work, preserved in an ancient text. Eventually, superior English breeds will be mixed with Spanish breeds to make merino sheep breeds. But that's not part of our story. What is part of our story is the Great Custom. Capital G, capital C, Great Custom. The English wool export tax that provided significant funding to the Crown. All this tax money got Parliament involved, and laws started to be passed supporting enclosures. All that started to create the third type of enclosure, the most important one. Enclosing common land and giving it to one or a small group of persons to farm or pasture sheep upon in a legal way that was as fair as could be managed. We need a little background here. Traditionally, a village would have fields which could be farmed by particular families. At this time, you didn't have the full right to sell or mortgage an estate. Modern people, especially Americans and Aussies, need to temporarily forget what they know about farms and farming. It was a Tudor innovation to allow up to a third of an estate to be sold. A lot of times, land was leased rather than sold, and this limited time use of land always encouraged exploitation of the land and underinvestment and exploitation of the people on it. So the Tudor reforms were a step forward, but it wasn't until the 17th century that land could be sold at will and used as collateral for a loan or mortgage. That would be key to unlocking the wealth of Britain, but we're getting ahead of ourselves here. So in a village, particular families could farm particular plots, kind of like ownership, just a little, but much of the land was available for anyone to use. That is what we call the commons. It was often wooded, so that's where you got your firewood, which you needed to live. That's where you could hunt to supplement your mainly grain diet. You could pasture an animal there, perhaps you could have a cow for milk. A flock of geese or ducks could also be kept in common on the commons. You could plant a hayfield. People often had vegetable plots there, and ordinary practice was that family efforts in that direction were respected by others in the village. So you could use the land, but in no way did you own it. And life was fully adapted for the fact that common land was available. Your own plot of land raised the grain you really depended on, and the common land supported the rest of your needs and wants. So you start with a functional village. People are farming and using the common land, and everyone is just getting by, barely. There's a better off group for sure, and those people are providing most of the charity we talked about before and guiding much village life. There is, in addition, the lord of the manor, living off rents, and either closely involved in village life or somewhere far away. Now, someone comes along and wants to change everything. fencing off the common land. One person would get it to use or rent out for farming or sheep, and maybe even in edge cases, as we're having global cooling, to raise timber. Doubtless, this is more efficient in economic terms than what the village was doing before, by a lot. But the little plots the villagers are living on are not really enough to live on without the common land. So what to do? What would you do if someone came along and wanted to turn your life upside down? Well, the church denounced the second type of enclosure, taking farms for pasture. Popular opinion was definitely against it. Laws were passed against it. At the time, it was understood to lead to homelessness, dependence, desperation, and crime. There were riots, murderous riots to return pasture to farmland, and the enclosures were technically illegal very often. But as we've said, the English state lacked an effective oppression apparatus, so people did what they wanted or could get away with locally. I know that from a modern perspective, this sounds really sketchy. You're going to take land from people and use it for yourself. You don't even have the weak excuse that it's legal. What about the rights of the people you're taking land from? Well, they were generally long-term leasers at some point along a 3-generation lease, which sounds a little crazy, but leases were often not specified in years, but lifetimes. A 3-lifetime lease was pretty common. And even though you might be just renewing a lease, you had more rights than we would expect today. You had a right to take berries from some patch of land, a right to graze pigs over another after harvest, to glean a different patch. Gleaning is picking up the dropped bits of grain after harvest, one of the things communists made a death penalty offense in the Soviet Union. Those rights don't go away just because your lease is up. This is a very important point, which will drive a lot of the change we will see.
Gleaning was a death penalty offense under communism.
Well, it's communist ideology meeting reality. It's more complicated than anyone expects when it hits the real world. Add a little paranoia and you get a lot of death penalty offenses. What's that joke? They shoot people for breathing too deeply here? So back to enclosures. This second type of enclosure is illegal, violates rights, and is highly unpopular, goes against most Christian values, and yet it still happened in the 16th and 17th century. It would end, though, as courts became more effective. Eventually, all these ancient rights would gradually be extinguished, however, later, as the miracle was occurring by a more powerful force, property values. Property values are a thing that moves history. Hold that thought for a moment, though. Property values are a thing that moves history. You can see that taking people's land by force, basically, and running it for your own profit would have some drawbacks. For one thing, you depend on force rather than law and custom. And force is expensive, and this is all about profits. Lots of landowners tried out illegal enclosure and ended up dead. Righteous anger is a powerful force, one that sometimes prevails against superior force. Also, lots of other landowners were too virtuous to enclose land. You could lose status in their eyes. Also, there was Star Chamber, a way for poor people to appeal to the king for justice outside the local legal system that might be rigged by the landowner. And the king came down on landowners pretty often, and who wants that kind of attention? A bill of attainder might follow, any excuse for a king to get money. Just as a reminder, a bill of attainder is an act of parliament aimed at a particular person, which basically gives the king all that person's money and property. So this second type of enclosure was happening. Not that much, though, and it was never, by its very nature, going to fix the patchwork of rural rights and landholdings that kept England as poor as the continent. It was the same there, same problems, people trying the same solutions. But enclosure was such a good idea, making 3 large farms out of a crisscross of rights to a patch of land here and a patch of land there. At this point, it occurs to me that most of you, certainly not Australian and American listeners, do not know what I'm talking about. You think of a farm as one big contiguous piece of land, and next to it is probably another farm. It's also a big continuous chunk of land. I'll look for something we can put on the website to show the reality. There's a map in Adam Tooze's Wages of Destruction showing a farm area in southwest Germany and the ownership structure before World War II. And England used to be like that. America never was, Australia never was. In America, you got a grant to one big contiguous piece of land, a huge farm by European standards probably, And you could just farm it as it suited you. You could balance yields against the effort to farm it, prices you could get, make decisions on what technology to invest in, all the while knowing your contiguous 1,000-acre farm could get full benefit of it. A village back then in England might have 1,000 acres of farmland, farmed by 20 farmers, with an average of 50 acres each, but it wouldn't be like a nice grid with 5 columns and 4 rows of 20 50-acre farms that an American would expect. No. A map of the village would look more like a color blindness chart. You know, the ones with lots of dots and a number written in slightly contrasting dots? Change the dots into tiny rectangles, a half acre, 1 acre, 2 acres, representing the full 1,000, with 20 different colors all scattered around, each color representing one farmer's land. A crazy patchwork quilt that no one would ever have set out to design. That's what the rural landscape was like. A consequence of 1,000 years of little deals, trading land rights back and forth. Describing village-based land ownership as a color blindness chart is only a mild exaggeration for some real situations. And this is crazy. So even some enclosure was voluntary. People would get together and trade this patch for that patch, group bigger and bigger patches together so that farming could be efficient. No problem. Of course, that didn't work very often, not in the monkey world. It's just not like that. You could never get everyone to agree. You generally didn't even have the right to fully sell your land anyway. Some people would just want things to remain the same. Others would suspect cheating. There was a long history of cheating. You just wouldn't get people to agree on a voluntary project when it comes to farmers and land. Too emotional, too full of import. These kinds of coordination problems would plague European countrysides until modern times. England pretty much got it fixed early by the 19th century, and things were going in the right direction strongly in the 17th century. It doesn't change the tragic nature of economic rationality, however. So how did they achieve rationality or partial rationality? Enclosure.
Is enclosure like a taking?
What do you mean by a taking?
Like in the US Constitution, no property can be taken without just compensation. And in Australia, it's a bit broader. It's not just compensation, it's called just terms, and these terms can be anything the legislator could reasonably regard as fair. And also it has to take into account all the interests affected, not just the owner of the property.
Oh, that's great. I didn't know that about Australia, but compensation is just a sum of money. If they take your house to build a freeway, they pay you the value of the house and you can go get another. But the memories and feelings the place evokes for you, they can't give you those back in compensation. Near where I live, they took a whole neighborhood to build a new downtown. Nice downtown. They took houses and some businesses, auto repair shops, as I recall. Everyone got fair financial compensation, but the business you devote your life to, that you hope to leave to your child, well, that's gone. Remember the Jethro Tull stuff last episode?
Yeah.
Yeah, they actually have a song, Farm on the Freeway, about someone who inherited his father's farm and was creating something for his son there, a life. But they built a freeway and gave him money, $1 million, and took away his farm.
Whew, $1 million is a lot.
The line in the song is, after he gets the $1 million check, I was a rich man yesterday.
Ow. I guess dreams are tied up in property sometimes.
Yeah, sometimes fairness and justice are impossible. There started to be process in Parliament, later formalized by statute, where the majority of landowners would agree to divide up the land and the rights in some efficient way. This process was eventually required to be 80%. Parliament would approve it, send out commissioners to draw up new boundaries in a definitive way, and provide compensation to everyone who lost rights. This worked village by village. And well, this worked, kind of. I mean, do you think people got just compensation for 100 little rights that were only half remembered and half taken seriously by the commissioners? And if you were compensated fairly, it might be like winning the lottery. How a poor person who doesn't manage money well, life is often not made better in the long run. Through experience over many, many decades, it got better and became more just and fair, slowly over time. Oliver Cromwell was working on some enclosure politics in the 1620s during his first stint in Parliament, if I recall correctly. The injustice of it really got his outrage up. And it got better. And then the English Civil War came along. All the feudal tenancy rules and the Court of Wards was abolished. The Court of Wards was how the crown managed land inherited by someone too young to manage it. Now we don't have a crown. We don't need this. In practice, The crown used to give someone a sweetheart deal. They would exploit the land for a few years, and the heirs and the people living in the village would be screwed by the short-term incentives of the Court of Wards. But now, that's in the past. In addition, restrictions on markets were abolished. Restrictions on sales prices, on who could sell to whom, on the amount of seed grain you could hold, not sell, or that you could sell at a particular market, a particular fair. Now, agriculture was finally made safe for capitalism. Land could be bought, sold, mortgaged, just like any other commodity. This is big. This was all done by the Republican Parliament I mentioned in episode 1. Possibly the world's greatest parliament in terms of effect, that stupidly tried to send the army home without paying them, without paying widows' pensions, breaking all promises, the best and the worst parliament. How can this be? And now property prices make their entrance. Okay, so now I have my 1,000-acre village with a crazy patchwork of holdings. It's a color blindness chart, remember? And we're going to talk about 2 villages, call them fat and lean, like in the Jack Sprat nursery rhyme. Fat is way better than lean. We're talking about Lean Village first. And one of the 20 farmers there wants to sell his land. Oops, no, he's dead. His widow wants to sell the lands and move to a city. How much will it be worth? Well, if it's his land, but someone else has rights to cross it and graze sheep on it on alternate Tuesdays, and you can't fill in the old pond because everyone has rights to that, well, you can see it isn't so clear what the land is worth. You can't, as a buyer, even really know what you are buying, what rights other people might have to use your land, what they might claim later. So that really limits what you're going to pay. I mean, imagine you're Joe Farmer. You got knowledge of markets and new techniques, and you really want to put them into practice and secure a future for your family. What would you pay for some dots on the color blindness chart? How can you be sure your ideas would even be allowed in that environment? Or maybe you are Joe the wool exporter, and you're sick of the smell of wool and the stress of your whole life, the killing stress depending on each and every shipment, and all around you the other exporters are going bankrupt all the time. You need to leave the business, buy some land, rent it out, live off the rent. Could still be stressful, but less so, you imagine. Or maybe you're just plain Joe. A farmer has status. Someone with land is admired. There's a whole life that goes with having land. Your children will automatically have higher status marriage prospects. And for many, bettering your children's prospects is the most powerful motive force. Something hard for us to remember, but would be very much in the minds of anyone at the time who was a mere laborer. The desire for land was the desire for status. And it was the desire for the best life, within the subset of attainable lives, a person could imagine. Incidentally, no, not at all incidentally, vitally, this is the story of America. The people coming from Europe to the colonies wanted land above all. If they had to work for money wages, it was just to build up a stake to buy land, build a little house and start farming. But once you had the stake, you were out of there, because that money, that land equals status and a better life for your children. Monkeys and hobbits both crave status. As Adam Smith said, we don't just want money and power. We want to be lovely.
We want to be lovely. I like how that sounds. What do you think he meant by that?
I think he means we want respect from others and for ourselves. We want admiration, and we want to feel we deserve it.
Yeah, I agree. I think we as humans can have all the wealth and the power and the status we desire, but without that sort of personal validation and loveliness, we feel sort of empty.
This is one of the main reasons that as early as the 18th century, America was the highest wage place on earth, because few actually wanted to work for mere wages. And as soon as they could, they would leave that job. Not everyone, of course, but so many that the laws of supply and demand drove high wage rates higher and higher until it was the highest in the world as early as 300 years ago. It wasn't that American workers were the most productive necessarily back then, but they had better things to do than wage labor. All right, off that tangent. Back to Lean Village. Joe Farmer won't pay much for the land there. Joe wool exporter won't. Just plain Joe might. Money's not a big part of his motivation, but he doesn't have much money to pay. In contrast, however, a few miles off, there's another 1,000-acre village, Fat Village, and it went through a parliamentary act of enclosure for Fat Village. All the old rights were settled up and eliminated, and we have nothing but fairly compact little farms with everyone having full rights to their own land and no rights to anyone else's. Some people got screwed over in creating Fat Village for sure. And also, in practice, the rights were never as neatly cleaned up as that. Land crossing rights, for example, were very persistent, and they still exist all over Europe. But here in Fat Village, the buyer could at least understand what he was buying and have confidence he could sell it later if he needed to. He would pay about 5 times as much for the same acreage in Fat Village as in Lean Village. Now everyone in Lean Village hears about the land sales over in Fat Village and wants to get in on an enclosure. It's 5 times as valuable. Should I go through a lot to be 5 times wealthier? There are going to be some holdouts. Change is hard. I don't like it. In some areas of your life, you don't either. But we don't need 100% to go along. Only landowners get a say here. Push enclosure through Parliament, and our land values go up like Fat Village, and now Lean Village changes its name to Happy Village and puts together some slick marketing material. Good times. Whoa! Did agriculture in Britain just become safe for capitalism? I think it did. Wow. Congratulations, Britain. You're the first big country to have capitalism in agriculture. Holy shit, it's the 17th century and you're starting to see some capitalism. No wonder you outcompete everyone else. How much better off are you? 80% better in relative gross terms than France. 80% better in relative gross terms than France. Remember, I keep telling you to remember that 80%. Now, how much higher are your net profits? They're going to be a lot bigger than that. We don't have great figures, but maybe 400 to 500% or so. How did this happen? There was a civil war, and a Republican parliament just abolished all the old feudal stuff, except what people kept between their ears, by voting for legislation. Wow, and you're rich now. Getting there anyway. Nice work, guys. So, Christopher Hill, one of the greatest historians, argues that this utterly unique occurrence in world history made Britain different from everywhere else, and the 80% superiority in agriculture, and much higher in profit, the commercial supremacy to come, and our miracle all flow downstream of this. It's a hell of a good argument. Being able to capitalize land, or any asset, really means you can get a future value for it today. In other words, time and the future can work for you in a way it normally cannot. A basic fact of the universe is no longer so much an obstacle. Time can work for you. This is such a gigantic advance, it's not surprising he would make that argument. He's right, of course. But I would add that Britain was already different or this never would have happened. And most history is a history of squandered opportunities. But we're not going to squander this one. We took one step out of feudalism, not that feudalism is a coherent concept, and into capitalism, not that capitalism is a coherent concept. We all have an idea of what that word means in our heads, but we also know that smart people are stupid, so we're most likely wrong. In any case, it was a big step forward. But why didn't we step back? Failure is more common than success in the world. So is that it? We have a little capitalism now? So the agricultural revolution is solved? Nope. See what else we need next week.
Okay, we'll figure it out.
We're sitting outside on this nice day at the end of July 2020. And there's some birds tweeting in the distance. We've just listened to one of our favorite people, Quokka. Camie, you just got to hear the episode.
Well, I did not know before the concept of enclosures, so I greatly appreciated that. Patchwork and colored blindness chart examples.
Cool.
Reorganizing to make it more efficient made it more valuable, even with the pain and the growth and the change. That was a great example for me to picture it all.
Well, a lot of people would lose out in those situations, though.
Oh, of course they
because
would.
It's so efficient, they don't need so many people there. and so they've just become surplus. No one's going to hire them to work the farm anymore because they need so many fewer hands.
I guess politics probably had a hand in it too.
Yeah, I mean, we'll talk more about it later, but in the wars with France, they were very conscious of needing to improve food production in England, reduce imports, and make their country richer in order to win wars, especially the wars against Napoleon. There's a lot of people being, very, very clear. This is why they're doing the enclosures and pushing them through, even though there's a lot of local opposition. A lot of the locals didn't want it. Of course, it changed their lives. And actually, next episode is going to be more about the downsides of doing the enclosure, more about the tragic element.
And changed their lives, that's for sure. And something about 80% better than France.
Yep.
Did I follow that correctly?
Mm-hmm.
The output. Is that because France stayed with the lean village model?
They tended to have really large estates. They had a model more a model of serfdom. Oftentimes, getting people to work was a matter of feeding them. Put a lot of effort.
And you're going to get so much productivity when you beat your people who are working.
The workings will continue until morale improves.
Yeah. I can see that being a real drawback.
Yeah.
Where Britain, when people have their own little plot of land and their wealth, if it's even adding the floor to their house or whatever it was, they'd be motivated instead of just being beat to work more.
Yeah, so most people, they have their plot of land, they had to pay rent, own it themselves. On the end, they knew they had to pay the rent, but anything they could earn up above the rent, they could keep. And you could plan for a future, but only if you know it's yours. If it's just something you have for a short period of time, then you're just going to exploit it and just get the most cash value out of it that you can. And that doesn't work as well in the long run.
You're talking about the leases there, the lifetime type leases?
Yeah. Yeah, if you think you're not going to get your lease renewed, or just whenever your heirs aren't old enough to actually take over legally, then the Crown would get to use the revenues and use the land during your minority.
Trash it on the way out.
Sometimes, yeah, that did happen. And thanks for coming on the program, Qualcomm98. I really appreciate it. I promise you, I read all the reviews, and I got a very kind one recently. I very much appreciate that.